Welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. Join me, Pandora, and my guests as we explore history, cultural traditions, science, spirituality, social justice, and the healing aspects of the arts. My guest today is author, historian Dr. Michael Schoeppner. He's an associate professor and pre-law advisor at University of Maine, Farmington. He's the author of Moral Contagion, Black Atlantic Sailors, Citizenship and Diplomacy in Antebellum South. He's currently working on a book about the early history of immigration law. He teaches classes on colonial America, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and American legal history. There's a parallel between what was happening in the 1800s to immigrants and free black sailors with what's happening today in terms of immigration laws, birthright citizenship, and more.
Yeah, I think my work is unfortunately more and more pertinent given what's going on, especially in the last few weeks with regards to the complete absence of due process, which is very much similar to what we see going on in the period before Reconstruction. And thank you for your work too.
So your book, Moral Contagion, especially focuses on the time between 1822 and 1857 when approximately 20,000 free black mariners from America and Britain were jailed for coming into southern ports under new laws. Up until that time, free black sailors moved freely on the Atlantic, and this was at a time when between 20 and 25% of the crew were composed of free black sailors. And that number was even higher in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so I'm working on a second book right now that actually looks at some of the precursor to these laws. So typically, free black mariners were exempt from laws that were already on the books that restricted the immigration of free black people. So in a lot of states before 1822, it was still illegal for free people of color, whether African American or born outside of the United States, were not allowed to migrate to, say, South Carolina or to Virginia. Those states had pretty much enacted what I would call immigration bans based on race. But sailors were exempted because they weren't looking to immigrate. They were just there working. And given how connected the early United States was to the Atlantic world and how essential international and interstate trade was, having black mariners was really important because, as you say, they're a huge chunk of the maritime workforce. So they are usually exempted. And then in 1822, black sailors become specifically targeted and included in these bans against free black immigration. So the laws become even more rigid and more expansive. No longer are some southern states banning the immigration of free black people. Now, free black people can't even come in for a few days. If they even arrive in port, they're going to be taken off their vessels and placed in jail. And this expansion of the laws is largely in response to liberatory movements amongst enslaved people. So in 1822, South Carolina is the first state that expands its black immigration ban to include the temporary arrival of free black sailors. And they do this because this happens in the midst of the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy. And Denmark-Vesey was a free man of color, but he was supposedly organizing this massive slave rebellion to cut off Charleston, South Carolina from the rest of the state, execute white people, and basically overthrow slavery. And in a petrified state afterwards, South Carolina politicians decided that it was time to cut off the umbilical cord to the revolutionary Atlantic to prevent people like Denmark-Vesey from using black mariners to spread, quote, his evil message of abolitionism. So there are a little bit different sort of issues, right? Black immigration bans are to prevent the free black population from growing. These laws against black sailors are about protecting slavery and preventing slave rebellion. So that's where it comes from. And as threats of slave rebellion sort of pop up in various places throughout the Antebellum South after 1822, other states follow in South Carolina's footsteps and enact laws that prevent free black sailors from arriving. And so I've always only able to enumerate about 20,000 arrests, but my guess is it's probably quite a bit higher than that.
Tell us what that imprisonment included to go from unrestricted movement and autonomy to imprisonment. Can you talk about that shift and the threat itself?
Yeah, so part of what I was getting at in the book is that this imprisonment was not just about preserving the slave system. I think that was one of the initial reasons, but it was more than that. We would now call it like content creation, right? So this was liturgical. This was theatrical. There was something performative about going onto a British vessel, for example. If you are a South Carolina official, right, going onto a British vessel, which has a British flag above it, it is a symbol of British sovereignty, taking a black British subject, taking this free person of color, right? Many of them had never seen slavery before or lived in enslavement before, taking them off of their vessel, putting them in chains, which all across the Atlantic world, chains is a representation of enslavement, hauling them through the town, through the city, because the jail cell in Charleston is a few blocks away from the port, and it's some of the busiest parts of Antebellum Charleston, and carry them through the streets in chains to the jailhouse, where you see people who are there for breaking the social order. And then when they are in jail, in Charleston, for example, they're required to do chores. So this is not just about sort of detaining someone, right? This is also about humiliating them and to making them feel as though they are within South Carolina's racial hierarchy. So it's imposing this form of social relationship on people that are, by and large, not a part of it. So there's something liturgical. This was not just about arming free Black sailors. This is also about imposing and intimidating people on the ground in Charleston. And that's the way it is with all immigration law, right? It's not just about targeting outsiders. It's about sending a message to people inside. But this is about constitutional issues, right? Do the states have the power to interrupt interstate commerce? Because that's supposed to be the federal government's role. And what the states of the South said is, well, these are not interruptions of commerce. This is about protecting the health of the people of South Carolina in the same way that Charleston can take a vessel and quarantine it for 40 days because somebody on board has yellow fever or malaria or something like that. It has the same inherent right to ban people that are suffering from moral contagion, with the idea that people's ideas are just as transferable, just as communicable as a virus or a bacteria. Now, they didn't understand viruses and bacteria back then, but the idea that if you are around people with dangerous ideas, you're susceptible to learn them, that was the rationale behind it. So they quite literally used the terms moral contagion, moral pestilence, to define free people of color so as to justify the creation of this theatrical performance to impose racial hierarchy and to intimidate free Black people and enslaved people in the state itself. And again, that's exactly the same language and sort of process that we see right now. We have college students and graduate students now who are being arrested because they are, for instance, protesting what's going on in Gaza. And they're being targeted for that because of their moral contagion, and the government saying that they are dangerous outsiders. And because they're dangerous outsiders, sort of constitutional concepts don't apply, that this is about self-preservation, and that is somehow ultra-constitutional or something. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's one of the striking parallels between sort of the 1820s and 30s and 40s and what we see going on right now.
Yeah. And another thing about the rhetoric that's being used, and there's always this through line of the propaganda versus the reality. Like right now, they're being called terrorists and they're equating this ideology of freedom and life for Palestinians as being anti-Semitic or in some way dangerous or a threat. It's actually the ideology of liberty, life and liberty.
Yeah. I mean, and that's because what's most disingenuous about this discourse is that what is dangerous about saying that, the Declaration of Independence should be honored? That's what the fear was for free Black people, right? Protesting war. Like, what is inherently dangerous about that? I mean, a long time ago, the Supreme Court said that sort of arguing for peace is not a violation of free speech. What is really dangerous about nonviolence? What is really dangerous about celebrating the ideals of the Declaration of Independence? It's this subversion of the things that are best about American ideals and painting it as dangerous. It's Orwellian in a sense.
The economy of the Antebellum South was deeply interwoven with the Northern economy, the triangular trade and imports and exports to the Caribbean plantations, as well as trades to Spain and Great Britain. There was this moral ambivalence, the reluctance of businessmen to dismantle slavery.
This is the issue, right? I mean, in essence, what the southern states are doing, if not necessarily their intention, but eventually they know this is going to happen, right, is to convince the maritime powers to stop using Black crewmen. And so that puts Great Britain, who is a commercial powerhouse and is trading extensively with the South, and northern merchants and merchant companies in a position where they have to decide whether they're going to incur the costs of having their Black mariners incarcerated. When they're incarcerated, by the way, these free Black sailors, they're charged for being in jail. And the captain is supposed to be responsible for paying those costs. Now, much like tariffs, when you start taxing commercial enterprises, that gets forwarded on to others. But you see an increase in costs and transportation costs. And so northern merchants have to decide whether they're going to cut out black mariners if they can, and if that actually saves money. And they also have to think about sort of the moral repercussions of this because they have a black labor pool that is very important. And, if they don't use black mariners, are they going to be able to man their ships? And so it's a bit of a dilemma for northern businessmen and for northern ship captains. And we see a very wide spectrum of responses. Some are perfectly happy, just paying over the jail fees and not making a big deal about this and trying to keep things on, the down low and on the easy to maintain these commercial ties. Others are much more vocal. Some captains are horrendous. There were a couple of captains that I have documented that leave free black people in jail. Instead of paying for them to get out of jail, they just get on their vessel and leave. And that's one way to skirt your costs, because now when the ship gets back to harbor, back in New York or Boston, they don't have to pay those wages. There is a perverse incentive for captains to ignore these orders and to just leave free men of color to basically rot in jail. And there are plenty of instances where free black men are stuck in jail for long periods of time. They're being forced to work because they have to pay off their jail fees. Some are there for years. In some ways, when we think about the rise of the prison complex and using black laborers through penal institutions, that's what's going on in New Orleans, for example, in the 1840s and 1850s. So there are some captains who are incredibly unscrupulous who do this. But it's also wrong to paint all captains that way because there are plenty of captains who fought tooth and nail. There's this wonderful story of one British captain who is on this vessel called the Susan King, and he sails into Wilmington, North Carolina. And the sheriff's deputies in Wilmington are trying to go onto this vessel to take this black British sailor off. And the captain says, "Get off my vessel." And the deputies end up leaving. They said that we'll be back. And he was like, "If you come back, we're going to mount the cannons on the vessel and we will shoot you before we'll let you come back on board our vessels." So there are this broad spectrum. And that's, again, sort of part of the problem that you have to rely on. If you're a black mariner, you have to rely on sort of the ethics of your captain to determine whether it's even safe for you to enter the southern ports. And then you have to make the decision, are you going to sign on to these vessels? And, black mariners sometimes reject going south themselves, right? If they know that a vessel is going into New Orleans or Savannah, they won't go on it. There's a huge revolt on Merseyside in Liverpool where black sailors were signed on to go on this vessel. They were supposed to go to a northern state. Instead, they found out that they're going to New Orleans. And so they rebel. There's this sort of huge conflagration in Liverpool because these black sailors don't want to go to the southern United States. So this creates a political problem in the North. And it's usually black abolitionists and black anti-slavery advocates and their more radical white counterparts are the ones who are pressing to end these laws. And for the most part, the more conservative anti-slavery advocates and those that are willing to wash their hands of the slavery issue altogether, they're the ones that are seeking to appease Southern lawmakers and not sort of confront these issues as the humanitarian sort of abuses that they were.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Healing Wisdom. I'm Pandora Peoples, and we're here today with our guest, historian and professor Dr. Michael Schoeppner. Can you talk about the fear of uprising and the Haitian Revolution, and also maybe speaking to the abolitionist papers and pamphlets like David Walker's pamphlet?
Yeah, sure. One of the reasons that black migration bans are first put into place in the 1790s. So, the Constitution is like 5 years old. We're talking about the era of George Washington's presidency. We see North Carolina and South Carolina and Virginia passing laws to prevent the arrival of free black people because they're terrified about what's going on the island of Saint-Domingue. This is a French colony in the Caribbean that in the 1780s and for a couple of decades beforehand is the world's preeminent sugar producer, and it's being produced on these backbreaking sugar plantations. Over 90% of the population of Saint-Domingue is enslaved. And in 1791, the enslaved of Saint-Domingue instigate the largest slave rebellion in the history of the world. And unlike just about every other slave rebellion that happened before Saint-Domingue, these rebels succeed and they overthrow slavery and they create a black republic that we now know as Haiti. But it takes a long time for this to actually happen. The first sort of fires of the Haitian Revolution start in 1791. but there is not an independent Haiti until 1804. So this is a long time by which we see these slave rebellions going on. And as it's going on, Southern slaveholders are terrified about what's going on. Some of them can't even comprehend the degree to which the world is being turned upside down. We have to talk about the American Revolution as this period where the world got turned upside down. Then I don't know what to describe. I mean, and people at the time didn't know how to describe what was going on with the Haitian Revolution. But these bans against free Black immigrants were largely targeted to what they called at the time, quote, French Negroes. So they were terrified that French Black people coming from Saint-Domingue, now turning into Haiti, would spread these revolutionary ideals and overthrow the slave system in the South. And so that's where these initial Black migration bans come from. In 1803, Congress puts its stamp of approval on these Black immigration bans that are being passed by the individual states, specifically because they're terrified of what's going on, not just in Saint-Domingue, because the Haitian Revolution's fires have spread throughout the Caribbean. So there's a slave rebellion in Guadeloupe. There's rumors of slave rebellion in other Caribbean islands. And so Congress wants to let the other states know that, hey, if you want to pass these laws, we're not going to stand in your way. We understand the sort of dangers that these pose. So that is sort of the initial impetus behind it. Every time that there is an intensified fear of rebellion, Southern lawmakers tend to squeeze and use the law in a much more forceful manner to prevent or hope to prevent slave unrest from manifesting into revolution. So Denmark Vesey is another one of those. We talked about that earlier. A free Black carpenter who has it. I mean, he had visited Haiti. He was a free Black sailor before he was a carpenter in South Carolina. He had intricate knowledge of the trading networks of the Atlantic world. He was a Black sailor. He was the dangerous Black sailor. And then, 9 years later, we have a Black Bostonian, David Walker. David Walker also knew the maritime world. He had moved from South Carolina to North Carolina to Boston. He knew the maritime networks. He was a used clothier, so he had a clothing shop in Boston, but he is a rabid abolitionist, and he is a radical abolitionist. And he writes this pamphlet, tried to cajole primarily free Black people, but literally everybody, to stand up and fight for the freedom of all people. And he basically says that all Black people are enslaved, even free ones, until every Black slave is freed. And so this pamphlet starts making its way into southern ports. And when officials in Georgia and North Carolina find these pamphlets calling for slave insurrection, Walker is brilliant. He uses brilliant rhetoric. He says the American Revolution was successful and was righteous because when people deprive you of your liberty, you fight to get it back. And so slaves should do this too. And so when these pamphlets are found in Wilmington, North Carolina and Savannah, Georgia, the officials there just go crazy. They think that perhaps the end is coming, that Haiti is going to be resurfaced. And this is language they use. This is not me projecting back. They're talking about a Haiti part two. And so that's why they passed laws preventing Black sailors. The assumption is that Black sailors are going to be the ones bringing in these particular pamphlets. So this fear of insurrection is certainly one of the animating principles that creates, in the white mind, the need to more carefully and forcefully regulate their borders, and with Black mariners being sort of bearing the brunt of this anxiety.
And I would love for you to speak about the ideology of slavery. There was the perspective that it was perhaps somewhat benign, or even in the South, paternalistic and benevolent.
This is the ideological work that justifies this sort of action. Because it was pretty obvious to abolitionists in the North, to the free Black population, and certainly to the enslaved population, that the cause for slave revolt is slavery, right? That the cause for slave revolt is slavery. Now, I mean, that is, to modern ears, that is a no-brainer, right? But if you're an enslaver, that is an unacceptable rationale. There's this desire to have your life make sense, right? And to have your actions make sense and for it to jive with your moral code. And for a lot of enslavers, slavery was not the reason why slaves revolted. And starting really in the 1820s and 1830s and really accelerating after that, we have enslavers and free and white in the white population in the South generally embracing this notion that slavery was not a necessary evil, but a positive institution. And you mentioned paternalism, and that's sort of the way that historians have sort of described this ideology. It was a departure from the way that some enslavers thought about during the American Revolution, right? So during the era of the American Revolution, people across the United States white and black, increasingly thought that slavery ran counter to the Declaration of Independence. So Patrick Henry, for instance, has a long-running letter chain with abolitionists in which he talks about the fact that, slavery is problematic, that it seems to run counter, but we're not sure what we're supposed to do with it, because if we end slavery, then this nation that we're trying to build will fall apart. Thomas Jefferson expressed similar anxieties. Now, albeit he's expressing this anxiety as he is actively enslaving hundreds of people, but he's at least expressing anxiety, which is what we're going to see different a little bit later, right? And historians since then have really talked about this as sort of an era in which some enslavers are considering slavery to be a necessary evil, right? Thomas Jefferson famously said, we have the wolf by the ears, we have slavery, we can neither safely let it go nor hold on to it, right? So slavery is this problem, but it's inscrutable. I think people have rightly given Jefferson grief for that, because it tended to result in a sort of conservative response to this, which is just do nothing, really. But that ideology really falls by the wayside by the time we get to the 1820s and 1830s. In early 1800s Virginia, Gabriel, an enslaved man, has this large insurrection that almost happens, and it gets sort of cut out right before it happens. And when white Virginians are talking about this, many of them are saying, well, what do you expect to happen? Enslaved people are enslaved. They're not going to want to stay enslaved in this land of liberty. Right. So that's sort of the mentality early on. And we see this radical ideological shift in the 1820s and 1830s. And this radical ideological shift says that slavery is a good thing. It is not a necessary evil. It does not run contrary to the notions of the Declaration of Independence. It is a paternalistic institution. Enslavers are the father figures. They offer protection, discipline. They provide the material necessities of life for enslaved people. Enslaved people in return for this are supposed to be obliging. They're supposed to be humble. And all sides are sort of making out from this. Enslaved people have protection. They are learning civilization. They are supposedly learning Christianity. And they have a duty and obligation to honor and obey their father figure, their owner. And this is sort of the ideology of paternalism, and sort of creating slavery or describing slavery as this sort of fully functioning family unit. And so people like James Henry Hammond and Thomas Dew, they're articulating this as sort of the ideal social relationship. But of course, if you're going to describe it that way, you have to explain why Nat Turner is doing Nat Turner things, why Denmark Vesey is doing Denmark Vesey things. If slavery is really, as they're describing it, one big happy family, why are there constant concerns about slave rebellion? And so these laws against free black sailors and this discourse of moral contagion becomes sort of the explanation for why slaves rebel. Right. So slaves rebel not because slavery is bad, but because there's this poisonous ideology coming in, seeping into the South and poisoning enslaved people's minds. And because, and again, this is a time of profound racism, because Black people are intellectually stunted, they can't see through the way that they're being fooled by these nefarious Northern abolitionists. And that's why slave rebellion's happening. So if we simply cut off moral contagion, if we quarantine it, right, then we can prevent this from happening.
Yeah, so they were sort of the woke radicals of their time.
Yeah, they were the woke radicals of their time. But they're being painted that way, right, regardless of whether they're the woke radicals or not, right? But in a way, that was the idea, right? And what's fascinating about this discourse is that, it's full of holes from the beginning, in the same way that the migration bans, immigration laws that we have now are just, they're obviously not doing what the stated intention is, right? And radical abolitionists in the North point this out, because most of these quarantine laws don't mandate that the moral contagion stay on the waves in the ocean, right? If you're worried about the transmission of moral contagion, don't let the Black sailors in port. Keep them anchored at sea. But that's not what they're doing. They're literally taking them off of their vessel in chains. They're bringing them through the streets so that everybody can see them, and they're putting them in jail where there are free people of color and enslaved. So you're putting them in a position where if this was moral contagion, you're guaranteeing that there's going to be communicable disease sort of moving about, to use the same language. There are holes to this all the way around. This is not about preventing moral contagion. This is about showing to the people around you that if you think you're going to subscribe to moral contagion, we can do this to you. We just took a free man off of his vessel who has committed no crime. We put him in chains. We put him in jail. If he speaks up, we beat the hell out of him. There's this story of John Jones, a British sailor, who basically says, I'm not going to sweep the jailhouse. You're forcing me to stay here, but I won't work for you. And the jailer beats him to a bloody pulp for this, right? And so there's this exertion of white supremacy. This is the ghost in the machine. This is what it's really all about. And so this discourse of moral contagion is just a cloak. It's an ideological crutch, but it's not really what's going on. It's a language. It's a discourse. It's there for content. It's there for consuming. It's what convinces voters to vote this way because of this fear, and they're doing something about it. But it's not. This is not about moral contagion. This is about violence.
The South was the biggest producer of cotton. How dependent was the North and were the plantations on this cotton? Was there any question that they would just not go into port and not go into the South? I mean, were there captains who were deciding to change their trades and their trade routes?
So that is a fear. There's a sizable portion of the Southern urban elite. So we're talking about wealthy merchants in the South who despise these laws. Not because they give a damn about black sailors, but because they're terrified that this is going to increase costs. And even though the South is the largest sort of cotton supplier in the antebellum period to the world, and Great Britain's mills do rely on Southern cotton, and Northern mills do rely on cotton, the South is competing against other parts of the South. And so in Charleston, for example, the Charleston Chamber of Commerce comes out against these mariner restrictions because they're terrified. They're already on the outside looking in. I mean, by the 1820s, South Carolina's cotton production is going down and down and down, and the cotton belt is exploding in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So they're already at a disadvantage because of soil exhaustion and other things. And now they're giving merchants from Liverpool, from Boston, reasons to go somewhere else by increasing the cost here. So there are plenty, and they're usually Whigs, they're usually Whiggish, right, that are pressing for a relaxation of these laws. At the very least, let's not make them come off of the ship. Let's actually follow through on this discourse of moral contagion and let them stay on the vessel so at least it's not costing the captains a lot more. It's not causing an embarrassment. Because these stories are being sort of printed about in the abolitionist press. People in Britain are writing about this and publishing it. It's sensational. People are buying up these papers. People are buying it up. There's print capitalism going on here. So some Southern merchants are wanting this to stop. And Northern merchants are the same way. Yes, they need Southern cotton, but can they manipulate the competition between different Southern ports for these business interests to try to manipulate things? And some places do liberalize their laws. Even South Carolina eventually liberalizes its laws because, it's in their economic best interest to do so. Robin Blackburn, historian that's been around writing for quite a while, he framed it like this, right? That in the midst of slave rebellion and in the midst of soaring profits for cotton, Southern slaveholders and Southern merchants are caught in this sort of position where they have to decide whether they're going to make choices based on fear or based on greed. And at certain times and places, fear wins out and they lock down, right? But then other times, greed sort of increases, right? And they're more interested in maintaining their economic positioning vis-a-vis other Southern planters, but also vis-a-vis sort of, world capitalism. And that motivates them to loosen these laws. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. And it's not just sort of an individual mind that's sort of weighing this, right? It's the community at large that has to weigh this. And I think that is mimicked in some ways in the North. To what degree do we sacrifice this? Are we willing, for the sake of a handful of black sailors, to take this huge economic loss? I mean, those mills over in middle Massachusetts, they don't run if there's no cotton, right? So there's a lot of money to be lost if we sort of contest this, if we boycott. And boycotts really aren't ever proposed as a potential way to fix this, either by the Brits or by the Northern United States. That's the extent to which radicalism is able to penetrate formal politics in the North. And boycotts really aren't ever proposed as a potential way to fix this, either by the Brits or by the Northern United States. That's the extent to which radicalism is able to penetrate formal politics in the North. I mean, there are a bunch of petitions and there are declarations, but when push comes to shove, people aren't showing up at the Tesla dealership. I mean, showing up at the, showing up at the ports saying, don't trade with Charleston, don't trade with New Orleans.
We've been speaking with historian Dr. Michael Schoeppner. This is part 1 of 2. Part 2 will air next week. You've been listening to Healing Wisdom. You can find this episode and others like it on WOMR.org, healingwisdomradioshow.com, and wherever you get your podcasts.